the rest of the 90s, Richard and Eleanor rule England together. She's helping him. He's been away for half the decade, so he relies on her. And so now Richard and Eleanor become the next great leaders, the next great team of France. And one of the first things she did was appeal to Richard to forgive John for his conniving and conspiring against his brother while his brother was away. That John, of course, had been maneuvering and conspiring with Richard's enemies to try to take over power from him, and now Eleanor implored Richard to forgive John, and Richard did. I wouldn't have. I tell you, honestly, I mean, he was terrible. John was terrible. He didn't deserve to be forgiven, but of course, mother knows best. So wonderful Eleanor brought peace to their family, and in the last years of Richard's life, the two brothers were getting along. Richard was killed in a completely ridiculous incident on a small castle, Châlus-Chabrol, you see there, in 1199. He'd been home 5 years. It was a small besieging of a not very important castle. He went out to watch the preparations for its defense. He went walking around the perimeter of the castle outside, unprotected, without armor on, and leisurely walking around, basically somewhat arrogantly looking out. And a young man, a teenager, shot his arrow at him. And the arrow went deep into Richard's body and couldn't be extracted. And so almost immediately everyone there knew it was mortal. They captured the boy and brought him into the castle. And of course they were going to rip him to shreds. And Richard said, no, forgive him and release him, because this was my fault. I was out there, I was exposed, and he's just doing what he was supposed to do. So I don't want anyone touching him. And so he was released. And Eleanor came rushing to be with him and was with him when he died. And now, of course, she had lost two of her sons who were both to be kings of England. And now in 1199, John became the next king, King John of England, who then is king of England from 1199 to 1216. You all know that John is not a great king. In fact, John was a terrible king. John was a disaster and managed to lose all their continental holdings in the next years of his reign. So by the time he dies in 1216, he's lost everything on the mainland. Later, some English kings will return, but basically the Angevin Empire is ruined by John, and with the King of France taking back territory, piece after piece after piece. So John was not only a terrible leader in England, he was a terrible leader on the continent and lost everything. And of course, the best thing he did was sign the Magna Carta, which he didn't want to do. So we can't give him any credit for that. It's a good thing he did sign it. It's a good thing the barons made him sign it. But they were the reason that the Magna Carta was created, not John. So we can't give John any credit. But the best thing he did was sign the Magna Carta, 1215, the year before he died. It's a good thing he died when he did, because he had absolutely no intention of abiding by what he'd signed. So if he'd had 10 more years, he would have undone it, that's for sure. But he left behind a little baby, and so for the next 10 years, there was no government that could do anything, and so the Magna Carta had time to be renewed and renewed and renewed, and therefore it continued all the way on. For his mother, she retired from active leadership. John was, of course, old enough to take over and had no desire to have her interfering with his government. She was world famous by this time. She retired to the Loire Valley. That's the Loire. This, of course, had been the center of her life, the area of her life, while she was Queen of France, while she was Duchess of Aquitaine. And then in the last years, she moved into this abbey, which was one of the most famous abbeys in all of Europe, the Abbey of Fontevraud, which means the fountain of the valley, so Fontevraud, F-O-N-T, and then V-R-A-U-D. which there was a beautiful spring. It is located, and you can visit, and these are all contemporary pictures, so you can go and visit anytime you want, and you certainly will want to go and visit because it's one of the great historic places in France, in the Loire Valley. It was founded by a brilliant reformer in the church in the very last years of the 1000s, so a little bit ahead of Eleanor. But then by the 1100s, it had become one of the most progressive, interesting abbeys in all of Europe. And it was founded to have both men and women there. So that was the whole idea, that both men and women would live there. That is, religious men and religious women. And that the abbey would be run by an abbess. So you can see how progressive this was, that you'd have a woman running this institution with both men and women in it. And the abbesses all during the 12th century had been brilliant leaders and had led Fontevraud always in the direction of great education, great library, progressive center. And so her choice to spend her last years at the abbey was a brilliant one. Here's a view, here's a sky view of the abbey and its environs, because of course it had farmlands and all, a number of wonderful things were part of the land, and then the cells and a beautiful cloister at the center, and then the church. So this was the world that she retired to. Both her husband, Henry, and her son Richard and Richard's wife all were already buried here. So she was to finish her life here, live here in the residence, and then when she died, she would be buried here too. Beautiful countryside, rolling hills, right down to her own Poitiers and down to her own Aquitaine. So it was exactly the world that she knew. Spectacular cloister at the center of the church, a wonderful library, very learned visitors, lectures, professors, all different kinds of things that made it one of the most interesting and advanced residences in all of European church world. Here's the church at the Abbey of Fontevraud. Here's the interior of it. Isn't that beautiful? And you're looking across the tombs of Eleanor, Henry, Richard, and Richard's wife. All four of them are there. And there is Henry and Eleanor. Don't you think it's wonderful that they could be together for eternity? Just imagine the arguments that they have been able to have. They've had almost 1,000 years together, and so let's hope that in the future they'll be able to go over everything all over again. So there is Henry and Eleanor together in Fontevraud, in their tombs with their effigies on top of the tomb. That's polychrome, where the artist works in wood and then it's painted, sculpted images of the two of them. And so in her final resting place, here she is in one of the greatest abbeys of France, after 82 years, having been one of the greatest leaders of two nations, the mother of multiple kings and queens, the grandmother of more kings and queens. One of the last things she does when she's 80 is travel all the way to Spain to accompany her granddaughter, who was the daughter of her daughter, to Paris so she could marry the next king of France. So imagine the story of the circle of her marrying the king of France, and now 60 years later, her granddaughter is coming to Paris on the same roads, traveling through Poitiers, the same roads up through the valley, and the same roads heading back to Paris.